Hey guys, I hope you're doing well. In today's video we're going to be talking about floating plants and why you should have them in your aquarium. There are so many great benefits of keeping floating plants in your aquarium, so hopefully in this video I'm going to tell you guys all the reasons why you should keep them. I like to try and keep floating plants in all the aquariums I keep. Right now I'm keeping floating plants in my jungle aquascape aquarium and also my jungle aquascape fish bowl too. Ever since I added these plants in my aquarium they helped out massively. I especially noticed this in my fish bowl aquarium, so I think they're a really important addition. So now let me tell you guys 5 reasons why you should be keeping floating plants in your aquariums. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is how easy it is to grow these plants. This makes them a really good choice for people who haven't kept plants before. I kept them in both high energy and low energy setups and I found they're not very demanding at all. All you'll need is just a decent source of light for these plants. Because they grow on the surface of the water, they have full access to all the light available from your light unit, whereas other plants that grow near the bottom of your aquarium might not get as much light, which is mainly from other plants blocking off the light to them. Another thing floating plants are really good at is extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. With this ability and a good source of light, floating plants can grow really quickly. With my red root floaters I notice every day there's about 1 or 2 new leaves appearing, and then every couple of days a plant will start to split off into little plantlets. This is how the plant propagates through runners. Eventually what you'll find is that this plant will quickly take over the surface of your water, just like in the footage you saw earlier in the video. So for beginning plant keepers it can really give you a good sense of achievement. It will show you that it's not too hard to actually grow plants in your aquarium. There's so many different varieties of floating plants out there you can get. You're bound to find one you're going to want to grow. Another great benefit of keeping floating plants is that they provide really good cover for fish and shrimp in your aquarium. Top dwelling fish like betters and chili rasbors really appreciate this kind of cover. This helps to make the fish feel more safe in your aquarium. If you have fish that are prone to jumping out of your aquarium like betters, floating plants do a really good job at reducing this. In the wild, some fish like betters and small rasbors live in water that's stained with tannins. The tannins reduce the amount of light the fish sees, so these fish prefer dimmer lighting conditions. Floating plants will reduce the amount of light in your aquarium by a little bit. This will help to recreate the natural habitat that your fish are found in. The better we can replicate the fish's natural habitat, the happier they're going to be in your aquarium. In the wild, these floating plants do a really good job at hiding the fish from predators above the waterline. Floating plants kind of act as a barrier, so it prevents them from seeing the fish down below in the water. This will help to make your fish feel more safe and protected in your aquarium. And when we do this for our fish, we'll start to see more natural behaviour like schooling and breeding. I mentioned in my last point about breeding. Many fish use plants as a spawning aid. Betters, for example, will use it as an anchor for their bubble nests. Eggs catching fish like Daniels can use floating plants to hide their eggs in. It's always better to use a natural spawning aid than an artificial one. In my opinion, I think there's way more benefits of using a natural spawn aid instead of an artificial one. The floating plants do a really good job at providing cover for baby fry. There's loads of little areas they can hide in, like in the roots. This will be really useful for small fry to survive until they get a little bit bigger. They can also pick on any biofilm that's growing on the underside of the floating plants. This gives them a really good source of food, especially when they're young. I've also found that floating plants are really good for baby shrimp. Since they are so small, they can easily hide away in the massive floating plants at the top of your aquarium. Like I mentioned before, the roots provide lots of great hiding places for them. Also, because the shrimp's diet is mainly biofilm, these floating plants provide a great area for them to graze on. I found that floating plants do a really good job at helping to control algae growth in your aquariums. One reason why you might have an algae outbreak in your aquarium is due to excess nutrients in the water column. Algae will use nutrients like nitrates and phosphorus in your water column to grow and multiply. So if we reduce the amount of these nutrients in the water column, the less algae we're going to get. Floating plants do a really good job at removing excess nutrients from the water column. Because some floating plants grow really quickly, they can suck up a lot of the excess nutrients in your water column like nitrates and phosphorus. By reducing the amount of these nutrients available in the water column, the algae won't have enough nutrients to grow. So this means our floating plants are outcompeting the algae for nutrients for growth. Another way that floating plants can help to reduce algae is reducing the amount of light that reaches your aquarium. Algae and plants both need light to grow. One of the first things you should do if you have an algae problem in your aquarium is to reduce the amount of light. If there's less light, that means there's going to be less algae growth. Since floating plants grow on the surface of the water, they're naturally going to block off some of the light reaching the bottom of your aquarium. As these plants grow across the surface of your water, they'll send out runners running across all the aquarium. This will then reduce the amount of light in your aquarium and hopefully control your algae growth. I recently had an outbreak of green spot algae in my jungle aquascape aquarium. When I added some floating plants and let them establish themselves, it reduced the amount of light in the aquarium. This stalled the green spot algae of light, and then a few weeks later it all cleared up. One thing you got to look out for is that these plants grow really quickly, so you got to make sure they don't take over the whole surface of your aquarium. If this happens, your plants might not get enough light and start to die. So every few weeks you're going to need to thin out that layer of floating plants on top of your water. Another little bonus feature, since this plant can use up a lot of nutrients really quickly, it can kind of act as a natural filter. In fishbowl setups with no filters, floating plants play a massive role. Since there is no biological filter, floating plants can help to keep the water clean. As I said earlier in the video, they do a really good job at using up all the excess nitrates and phosphorus in the water column. The underside of the plant, like the leaves and roots, have a lot of surface area. This is a great area for friendly bacteria to grow. These friendly bacteria break down waste products in the water into less harmful ones. So the floating plant provides a really good area for them to grow. Also, floating plants are really good oxygenators. Since they are growing on the surface, they have an unlimited supply of CO2 from the atmosphere. They're also getting a really good source of light too. This, along with nutrients in the water column, really help with photosynthesis. The plant will use the CO2 from the atmosphere and convert it into oxygen. The oxygen dissolves into the water column and then is used by your fish. Here's one of my favourite reasons why I keep floating plants in my aquariums. I find that floating plants makes any aquarium look way more natural. Like I mentioned earlier, if we can replicate a natural habitat of a fish, the happier they're going to be. So by using floating plants, it makes it so much easier to replicate a fish's natural habitat. I also find floating plants make the top of your aquarium more interesting to look at. Looking at the top of your aquarium down gives you another view of your aquarium. So by having some floating plants on the top, it helps to make it more interesting to look at. These plants work really well if you're trying to go for a jungle aesthetic aquarium. Most of my aquariums have a jungle light theme, so it really helps to create that kind of atmosphere. Some plants like Amazon frogbit can grow these really long roots which drape all around your aquarium, and this can instantly create a very jungle-like look to your aquarium if you want that. It's really interesting to see your fish swim around these roots. Sometimes they end up getting so lost in them, but this also helps them to feel more protected, so it's a really good thing to have. So these have been my 5 reasons why you should be keeping floating plants in your aquariums. These plants are not very demanding at all. They just need a little bit of light and not a lot of flow. If you have these conditions in your aquariums, they'll grow really quickly for you. If you're looking for a recommendation for good floating plants, Lobelia natans is a really good choice. Another floating plant I recommend is Fluensis fluitans, also known as a red root floater. I'm currently growing this stuff at the moment and it's growing really quickly. Amazon frogbit is probably one of the most common floating plants you'll see. A lot of fish shops stock this plant, so it shouldn't be too hard to find. Just like with all the other floating plants I mentioned, this one isn't too demanding either. One floating plant I recommend not to keep is duckweed. Duckweed can grow insanely quickly. I've seen some people say it grows into new plantlets every couple of hours. You might think it sounds like a good plant to keep, but it really isn't. Since it does grow so quickly, it can easily take over your whole aquarium. You'll end up just removing loads and loads of it every time you do maintenance on your tank. And because it grows so small, it can be difficult to remove from your tank. If you see even a single piece of duckweed, it can just multiply into so many so quickly. So I recommend you stay away from duckweed as best you can. I'll leave some links to all these floating plants in the description and in a comment below for you guys to try out if you want. If you guys enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel to see more. Leave a comment below, let me know what floating plants you keep in your aquariums. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm growing a lot of red root floaters, so I'm interested to see what you guys are growing.